welcome Mark Serban to the stage. Mark is the president of Mozilla. And Mark and I, we had a number of really good conversations about where we see AI going, what we want from the future of AI, what are things that are happening that are maybe not going the way they should go. And maybe we'll just start with that topic. So Mark, I know you thought a lot about this. What is, maybe just as an opening question, what are some of the things you are currently, you see that are happening? And what are some of the opportunities you see to influence the direction that AI is going for a better outcome in the future?
Thank you, Daniel, and hello, everybody. I guess first you got to think, what's the better outcome in the future? And there's a couple angles I might take on that. And certainly the future, I imagine, is networked. And you set that up really, really well. But not just networked or not just decentralized from a technical perspective. As a technical organization or two technical organizations, sometimes you think about that first. But why do you want things to be decentralized? And I actually think at this moment, really one of the things I think about in terms of a better future for AI or for society, for our economies, in terms of what we might imagine, is a networked or a decentralized digital economy. And sort of what do I think about that? When you think about the companies that are the mainframe AI companies, they're mostly on the West Coast of America, big tech companies, incumbents in the internet space, or in China. And they're building on this mainframe model. And I think one of the things that has struck me for a while, there was a Time magazine cover, I don't know, maybe it was even a decade ago, 6-8 years ago, of Mark Zuckerberg wearing this kind of as Caesar sitting on the throne. And whether you think about the Roman Empire or the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, those companies are actually as big, the five big tech companies, as those colonial empires in their economic power and their reach. And so what does that mean? Taking away the really abusive parts of that, it means that all the money goes back to the center. And so that's really, to me, one of the core metrics of what is a better digital society, digital economy, is the money is more distributed. The opportunity, the benefit are more distributed. And I think that's what I'm looking for. And I think then you need the architecture for that. You need the architecture that lets the data stay in places, that lets startups be everywhere, that lets research be everywhere. And that's really the vision that Mozilla has.
So there's a lot of things to unpack, obviously. I want to start with one of the things you said early on, and that is it shouldn't be decentralized just for the sake of being decentralized. And I think that's quite a key thing to understand, and I fully agree with that. I think part of this is. In the end, the decentralized model of the web worked and won over the previous mainframe era because it offered more value to users. It gave users what they wanted, and through that it got adoption, and through that it was the winning model. So for AI, going forward, part of why I'm excited about the decentralized nature, the decentralized capabilities that we have now, is that it allows you to build new kinds of systems. So Thunderbird is a great example, actually. For Thunderbird, I think the traditional model of just sending data to an API would have never worked. It was just out of the question. What are some of the opportunities that you're seeing where, by building a decentralized system, we can offer better value to users?
Well, I mean, it feels like a weird thing to ask me those questions in the sense that you had so many good examples in the opening, although one of them was a Mozilla example. But I think at the core, I'm going to go back and keep making fun of Silicon Valley big icons. But I think there was Eric Schmidt was the one who said a while back, like, privacy is dead, like give up, basically. And I think that is not obviously our point of view, and we have to reinvent what's the value that we want as individuals, what's the value we want as our communities, as our families, as our societies from privacy, and like how does it work? And so I do think that's actually one of the key things is like, what do we want from privacy? And then I think some of the things you talked about in that collective one, which is a really exciting example, are that, right? Something where I don't have to kind of totally expose myself or in order to get something that really is trained on data that isn't out there in the world and is trained on data that is me. And that actually, and you certainly could get that in Thunderbird or in something that is local and just specific to me. I could be fine-tuning or however you want to call it on myself. But then to go further, like, can I contribute to that and get value back from it? I mean, that's what's exciting about, the kind of DAO model or some other piece where you're going to data that I never want to disclose on its own. But like my community is in that model or my family is in that model. And so I think things that are customized to me, but that'll let me kind of be me and be private, I think there's a lot in that. I mean, there's many other examples, but that's the obvious thing to me.
Yeah, I think it's spot on. I think for especially now, there's a lot of talk about agents, building agents that work for you, and a lot of the code examples you see in the wild, they still use models that are sitting behind an API, but then the types of tasks that these agents could perform, the types of tasks are fairly limited because an agent where the model sits behind an API that is not under your control, that is under the control of someone else, will always have just a very limited view on who you are and your types of data. So I think a local AI model, you can just expose it to so much more data, and then you can fine-tune it, as you said. I'm quite excited to see what will happen with local AI models in that area.
I guess, to challenge it, but then, play around with it in some different ways. It's not true that behind an API model isn't going to necessarily know all of those things. In fact, often we disclose way more than we want or know. And I think the trajectory of the mainframe model, or even in terms of as we go to agents, is there's a set of very large companies that do have all our data, and that we disclose more and more and more and more, and that people don't care. And that's certainly not the future I want. But just to challenge, I'm nitpicking with you, but I don't think it's guaranteed that the future is that as we have agents, and we will automate more and more, whether we call them agents or not, that world is coming. It's not guaranteed that will happen in a way that we have agency. And so, I mean, it's actually kind of funny that's the word is agents, but the idea that we have control over it, that they actually are agents acting on our behalf, is really not at all guaranteed. But I think it is buildable, and that is where I do think local comes into it, but not just local. I mean, I think we're going to need trusted parties. Mozilla hopes to be one of them. I mean, we don't know how to get there yet. And maybe, I don't know if Flower will get into this business or is just the rails of it. But, we're in a world where already, even without things we call agents, we're moving through digital spaces and we have thousands of counterparties that are hammering at us or taking from us all of the time. And really, we don't have the cognitive abilities to be negotiating with them. Like, certainly we click cookie boxes all the time, but that's just like an infinitesimal part of what decisions are getting made about us and with our data all the time. So I think there's a piece about local, but there's also going to be a piece about, which is where the DAO stuff is kind of one example and interesting. How do we build kind of trusted partners to us to move through those automated spaces when we're not cognitively engaged with them, to know that the thing actually is on our side, to trust that it's on our side, to trust that agents are under our control, because we're not going to be actually aware that they're acting all the time. And so there's just a tremendous amount of trust that we're going to have to build in ways that I certainly would not want to offer to the mainframe companies of today.
So if you look at the history of Mozilla, Mozilla has already contributed in an incredible way to one of these transitions. Mozilla, I think the web that we all use and know today would look very different if it wasn't for Mozilla. So Mozilla has this track record of influencing technological transitions in a very positive way. I know that Mozilla is very active in AI and does a lot of things. How do you think Mozilla can best contribute, given the experience, to this new transition that is happening now?
Well, I think part of the answer, I'm here in this room to help find that out, because we don't know all the answers. And, people may not know. I mean, obviously, you guys know because we work with you. One of my jobs, I guess my main job in the last few years, has been to both bring Mozilla into the AI era. We talk about how could we do for AI what we did for the web, and I wasn't there in the beginning, and I think we were both, the people who were at the beginning were both smart and lucky to be able to kind of break things up and bring standards to the fore in terms of breaking Microsoft control. But it's not actually obvious how we do it again. I mean, I think we do need to do it for this era because AI is the sort of, as everybody here knows, the kind of fabric technology of how things get built today. And it is in that kind of mainframe concentrated model. I would say that the things we're trying are certainly to try to turn Mozilla into a more AI native organization. So we just spun off just a couple years ago. It didn't work the first time. We have a new CEO, a separate Mozilla AI startup. Their job is really trying to help open source AI adoption. So the thesis there is really, everybody who's doing open source AI, we want that ecosystem to succeed. And we want to have one arm of Mozilla that's really focused on that. Imagine it maybe being something closer to like a Red Hat or an Ubuntu of really accelerating and making it lower friction to adopt. But the other thing that we've done, and I don't know if that one will work, is our belief is we may not invent the Firefox that breaks things out. And that's why we set up Mozilla Ventures, and we've invested in Flower and a bunch of other interesting AI companies. So I think part of the answer is building as many founders, as many nonprofit labs, anybody building stuff that is aimed at this decentralized future and this open source future as possible. I mean, I don't know any other way to try it than have a vision of what's different and help as many people try to move there as possible.
And I know part of the vision of Mozilla is this concept that is called public AI. For those parts of the audience that haven't heard about public AI, could you maybe just give a brief intro?
Well, my guess is nobody has heard of public AI because it's a very, I'll say a little bit more, but has anybody know what we mean by public AI? I bet you nobody does. Oh, wait, one person back there. Oh, a couple people. Oh, that's not bad. So, I mean, really it comes from the idea that we believe there needs to be something different than the Silicon Valley big tech model of AI, which is mainframe in its model, but also is a particular set of owners, a particular set of incentives, a particular culture, and the Chinese model, which has also got its own particular versions of all of those things. That there really needs to be a third stack. That needs to be an open source stack at its base, but it's not open source in its, as an end in itself. It's open source because we really believe there needs to be, a set of common public goods, whether they're data, whether it's open source software, whether it's methods, all of those things, standards that anybody can build on. So if you go back to that idea of the vision for AI we have is really a decentralized economy, of digital economy where anybody can benefit, where you can control your own data. You need a system of public goods, basically, the equivalent of roads or the equivalent of the open source software stack that people can build on. But of course, it's not just the same. It's not just continuing the open source software stack of the last 20 years. There's kind of got to be a different architecture for it because you have data, because you have compute, as well as software and models. And so public AI is trying to be a vision. Maybe it's not the right name. We're kind of looking for the right name for it, of some set of public goods owned in common that allow all of us to be able to kind of have agency over where we take the AI era that isn't beholden to Silicon Valley or China.
And would this be something that's mainly driven top-down by governments?
I think you're asking a leading question. Oh, maybe not. Maybe that sounds like public. It could sound like top-down by governments. That's true.
Or is it more of a grassroots effort by community open source believers?
I think for me, it's both. Different people have used different versions of this phrase. So there's an idea that's been floating around. It was talked a lot about in the Paris AI Summit of an Airbus for AI. And so, if you think about that, in some ways, that's a compelling version of what I'm talking about, which is, the Europeans said, well, we don't want to just let the Americans control the aerospace industry. We're going to pool our resources and we're going to build a counterpoint. And I find that compelling. As a Canadian, I hope it wouldn't just be the Europeans who would build an Airbus for AI, because we need to band together with you in many ways these days. And actually, I think you could imagine you have amazing labs like the Allen Institute in the US. There's a lot of even American players who I think can plug into this vision. But I think that is really, that play is oriented towards something a little bit more top-down, how the people behind it are thinking about it. I think something like that, because that's something that would be about, say, taking government compute labs and investments across all of whatever regions are involved and coordinating them, maybe through federated learning. I think you also need to have that be something that's driven in a very bottom-up way by startups, by open source projects, by researchers. And ultimately, that's where open source is an output. But more importantly, as I think happens in open science and in good technical communities, open source is the lingua franca of things adding up or of innovation happening. So that by its nature then becomes more bottom up, because people just talk to each other by making things and by them being available under terms that allow them to fork them and use them and all those things. So I think it could be either. I think you need both.
So you mentioned open source quite a number of times, and there was fairly recently, or more like last year, this debate of open source and safety. So some people, not all, but some people argue that open source is actually quite dangerous as these models are getting better. What's your take on this?
When you say it was last year, I think there were some things that were really peaked about it over the last year or two, but it's still going on. And of course, the critique is, and you saw it if you looked at the AI summit that happened here in Bletchley Park, whatever that was 15 months ago, or November 2023, a real fear that open source AI is going to be the thing that's going to cause global terrorism to rise and all the bad things will happen. And, the only way to safety is the mainframe model. And our critique of that, and I think things have swayed dramatically back. If you look at all the open source stuff at the Paris AI Summit, our critique of that is it really was the big American companies who are using that safety argument as a moat to protect themselves and to kind of create a regulatory wall around themselves. And us and many other people, Hugging Face, many people made, I think, some good arguments in the U.S. policy environment, including stopping an AI bill that really would have been bad for open source in California last year, saying there really isn't a marginal risk or a dramatically different risk between open source and closed AI models in terms of bad actors are going to act badly and they're going to find ways to abuse these systems. There are some things that, though, really when you look at the researchers who've looked at, are worse with open source. So I think especially around CSAM and deep fake sexual images, that open source lends itself to certain kinds of abuse more, are kind of view on that is, the same as it would have been in a previous era of open source. The transparency is the best way to fight that kind of abuse. And so there's an amazing thing that was launched at the Paris AI Summit called Roost, the Robust Online Safety Tools. I think that's how the acronym works. But basically, it's sort of big tech grade, sort of Facebook grade, trust and safety tooling, including AI, that is open source. So if I have a startup or if I have a research project, I want to be able to do things like make sure I'm pulling CSAM out of my data sets, that's available through a set of either open weight models, because you don't actually want to see the training data for that stuff, or is available as open source software tooling around it. So I think that it's wrong-headed and self-interested, most of the people who are arguing open source is more dangerous. And B, open source, as has been the case in cybersecurity, is actually the path. Transparency is the path to more safety and security, if done right. But, you have to invest in the right software and tooling for that and use it.
That's true. So we talked about open source, and I think if we look at open source in AI, there's a couple of things that are related, often commonly referred to as open source. There's open source in terms of open sourcing the code. There's open weights in terms of just publishing the weights of a model. There's also things like open data. So if we look at all of these, and if we consider we're at the conference that is about federated learning and distributed LLM training, do you think the definitions we have today they're a good fit for running models in a decentralized way and training models in a decentralized way?
Yeah, it's such a good question and such a tricky question because, you didn't refer to it directly by name, but I think you're kind of hinting at it is, as happened 20, 25 years ago, there's a lot of, 20, 25 years ago, there was a lot of debate on what counts as open source. You also had the free versus open and all of these kind of debates that in my early career made me want to blow my brains out. But really, it took a while to kind of get agreement that the open source definition that the open source initiative has would be the thing that says this is open source, this is not. And I think we're in a little bit of that spot, but it's much more complex right now. It is helpful, especially because we're talking about how do things like open source interact with law and regulatory frameworks, to have definitions we can rely on. I use the term open source AI pretty loosely just because people know a little bit what you mean, but we need more precision in that. So the open source initiative has been working on an open source AI definition that talks about sort of the elements you mentioned, right? Is that the code, whether that's like the pre-training code or things used to build the system or orchestration or fine-tuning, whatever code is there, that needs to be under an open source license, that the models need to have open weights, and that they at least need to have description of the data sets, if not the actual data sets themselves. It is an interesting question. Those things are pretty understandable. There's not actually a lot of models that actually go, or AI systems that kind of in the LLM space that go across that whole definition, because, say, in Llama, there's no information about the training data really, and we know there's lots of problems with it. There's a few, like the AI2 OLMA models have open data sets. So I think it's an understandable and good definition. And like when you and I were talking the other day, it kind of breaks when you get to federated learning, because part of the purpose is that you don't actually want to know much about the data. And so it is a really interesting question. I think of federated learning as being something that is actually a real boon to what open source can be, especially open, when the technology is open source. But I haven't really thought, and I don't think, talking with the OSI people, how does that break or work with that definition? Because the purpose is to have the data be sort of more unknown and in many ways even undescribable.
And I think there's also an interesting connection to what you were saying earlier about economic opportunities. So one of the questions, we build a lot of open source, and one of the questions that even we sometimes get, well, if you just give away the code practically, then is there even an economic model that you can build around that, and can you sustain that in the long run, and how does that work? So if we think about a more decentralized infrastructure that is open source at its core, I think we all agree that it should be open source at its core. Do you think there's still economic models possible, and what could these look like?
It's really interesting. Well, just like people were arguing over what is open source 25 years ago, people were wringing their hands of how could you give it away for free and make money? And of course, lots of people have made money on top of open source, or people more often than not who have made money on other things have contributed back to open source because it adds robustness and lowers the cost of what they're doing. I mean, you can critique the level of corporate control in the Linux ecosystem, but also it is robust and evolves because of a lot of people are making money on top of having a robust infrastructure that the whole industry shares. And so I think we will find those ways. And what's actually nice, the woman who was interim CEO for Mozilla AI and we haven't announced the new CEO, is why I'm not saying their name, but it's somebody who's kind of well known in the research world and has run a successful startup. So I'm very excited when we announce that in the next few weeks. But we had an interim CEO there who was formerly the CEO of Canonical, the Ubuntu company, Jane Silber. And she's always really good at reminding me, there's 5 ways to make money on open source, don't worry. And they're not that complicated, right? It's like SaaS, it's like enterprise services and so on. So, you can just see it in what you guys are doing is you're going down the obvious paths. Probably people who have startups in here, it's the same things. I mean, there's only a few ways to make money, and people make money.
And I think one angle that I find interesting, we've had a lot of analogies with the history of tech today. So one analogy I find quite interesting is the internet itself is also based on open standards, TCP/IP, HTTP, and plenty of organizations and individuals found great ways to build commercial models on top of the internet. So I think the same is definitely possible for AI. Now, I want to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience also. Maybe just one more question before we go into before we open up to the audience, and that is, you mentioned privacy. So, what would you say? What are some aspects about privacy in the age of AI that are important to understand, and what's a way to define privacy in the age of AI?
I don't know how we do that with 12 minutes left and have the audience questions. But the Mozilla Manifesto, which people probably know, we have a manifesto which we use to make decisions about what we're doing, talks about privacy and security being, non-negotiable, not optional. And so that is central to who we are. And actually, I think our interpretation of that over the last, let's say, 5, 10, maybe even 15 years has been overly conservative, or at least not adaptive enough. And so, Mozilla's privacy commitments really have come from building a product that, as all the other browsers were integrating with other services, just didn't integrate with anything else, didn't collect any data about you. And what it meant was we didn't actually follow where users wanted value. And I think as we start building out AI features, we need to figure out privacy in a different way. And so that means looking at federated learning, looking at differential privacy, looking at secure execution environments and trusted enclaves. And so I think starting to look at places where the definition of privacy is not no data. And I think Mozilla for a long time kind of got in the idea that privacy means no data, but you can't do computing today with no data. And so I think, it is looking at, in many ways, not questions of no data, but who controls and who can see and who can use under what terms all the data are. But I think this is a group of people who is actually far deeper and far more advanced actually than Mozilla in thinking about what could privacy mean now. And that's the conversation going forward.
Absolutely. So now we want to open it up to questions from the audience. So please feel free to raise your hand, and then we can pass you a mic to make sure that also the online audience can hear you. There's a question over there.
Hi. First of all, many thanks. Is Mozilla as an organization considering using things like homomorphic encryption to be able to provide, the new kind of AI-powered features with very strong privacy preservation?
I mean, it's definitely something that we've started to look at and talk to also companies who are working on it potentially to invest in. I mean, it's not my area of expertise, and as I've looked at it, it's not ready to be deployed in a kind of a many hundreds of millions of users environment. But anything like that, which again, it's all the things I just listed a minute ago, whether that's homomorphic encryption or blockchain stuff or like new things that we don't know yet, like that's the stuff we're watching and like need to adapt to. And I think, I guess, the other thing that we're having to push ourselves to do is just build a new community and a new set of relationships, because the open source community around Mozilla historically is not the set of people who are in this room who are kind of tackling those things. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is how do we build that new set of relationships, so as those technologies evolve and get more ready for prime time, we can use them, or maybe we can even contribute to them.
I think there's a question here. That was first.
Hi, thank you very much for the conversation. I want to pick on one of the topics that you mentioned, which was how nowadays we already interact with so many stakeholders online, and as we move towards more decentralized AI and more democratized AI, right, where everyone is developing AI tools and using data from other people to do this, how do you see the challenge of explaining intent, right? Even in the basis of, okay, I want to do this project, I want to convince people to, be it through a DAO, be it through open data systems, whatever they may be, to give me their data. How do you think this can be explained throughout, right? In terms of not only just explaining what your project goal is, but also how what you're technically doing is actually achieving that goal, right? And it's something sometimes even you as a developer can't be 100% sure, so how you convince people to actually work.
So are you asking about how a developer convinces people of intent, or how I have intent as a user using agents, or both?
It's kind of both, because both developers trying to, get access to data to build an AI model, how do you convince people to actually donate to you or share with you their data?
I mean, I think there's a million answers to that, but kind of two categories of things that come to mind. The things you can do now, which are kind of easy and hard, but are kind of involve a explicit cognitive process that I'm aware of, and a explicit communication. So, that's where having high trust and a clear value proposition, or at least clear intent, can work in that way. So if you think about those million whatever people in the Vanna DAO, like the developer has said, here's a value proposition, somebody has made an explicit choice and gone and done that. Or we have or Wikipedia is in some ways an example of that. Or we have a thing called Common Voice, which is voice training data where people donate voice snippets and then do the tagging of them to create more voice data sets. So I think there are ways to kind of look at explicit value propositions and that. And in some ways, those are really important in many ways, but in some ways those can also help us learn about the anthropology of the trust relationships of figuring that out. But then I think what you're asking about, or what we're all grappling with, is like, how do you do that at scale all the time without knowing? And that is the really tough problem. I mean, it's the big UX problem of living in this society, and mostly it's going very poorly. And it is where I think the the people who are thinking about things like data trusts or things like DAOs are interesting people and be ahead of their time. Probably it does involve some version of institutions and not just individual responsibility, because we have huge, in fact, the biggest, wealthiest institutions on the planet as the counterparties to us. The idea that in some ways we should unionize or choose what unions we're in some ways to have counterparties to those agencies that we trust and have some kind of a fiduciary relationship with. I think something like that maybe is what one of the solutions to it. But yeah, I mean, it's a very big, hairy question.
I think it's also part where open source is at a huge advantage because through open source you can build trust, and even if you as a user maybe you don't go into the source code, you can trust that if the user community is big enough, probably someone else will. I'm a Firefox user. I've never looked at the Firefox source code, but I still love that it's open source. I think there was a question over there earlier.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I know that you said that people were recently scared of open source, and I think it skyrocketed with the XCutils backdoor. So I actually work for Canonical. We luckily were not impacted by that, but I think it was a meaningful thing to happen for us to learn more from that. So how do you think that the AI world can learn from that and take a lesson from what happened and make people trust it again? Because I had many conversations after that said,
and what was that? I just didn't hear the thing you said.
Yeah, for the XCutils, the backdoor that happened.
I don't even know what happened there.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it was a backdoor attack that happened on the XCutils package, and yeah, it was pretty critical, and many Linux systems were impacted. And yeah, so it was a commit in the code that was planted and nobody actually took a look at it. And yeah, it was giving backdoor access to everybody, and it was right there. It was in GitHub. Everybody could see it, and there was no action taken to prevent it. And when they found it, it was already too late in some cases. And this is good and bad for open source at the same time, because the bad thing is that it happened, it was there, and the good thing is that it's already there. We can exploit it, and we can see it, and we can prevent it with good.
I mean, I think that's there's two answers. The second part is the answer that has always been there, and I think in whether or not it's security or other abuses is the advantage of open source. It's just what you said, is that so many people have mutual self-interest in finding a mitigation, and there's transparency that even if it was missed for so long, it's discovered probably before, if it was hidden inside of a not known in some proprietary system, that abuse can be there for much, much longer, right? I mean, and so I think that's partly just the collective mutual self-interest of open source, and critical infrastructure is our, there's always going to be bad stuff, but it's our best hope. But I do think it kind of goes back to many different things with smaller libraries that have been exploited, over or broken down in the last decades, is how do we actually, Linux is actually, I think, in a better position because so many wealthy companies or everybody relies on it. It's when you actually have 2 or 3 developers who are doing something that's critical. And I still don't think we've found the solution to that. So there is something about open source economics that is a weakness that we still have to work through as a community.
I think there was a question at the far end of the room, and then also here later on.
Thank you for a very interesting conversation. So in the AI world, I've noticed that there is a lot of conversation about why technology is faulty, but not the people who are developing it behind it. what percentage of time, efforts, and resources does Mozilla invest behind behavioral research and sociological research behind AI development? And what are the specific initiatives that you are aiming to drive forward to enable safe people doing these things rather than blaming technology for its faulty outcomes?
The amazing question, and the answer is not enough. But certainly, one of the things that I started in trying to move us into the AI space was the foundation, which owns all of the Mozilla companies, but also does its own philanthropic and research work. There is a lot of our fellows and other things that we invest there. So that's, I don't know what percentage I could do it between all of the different companies, but about $30 million a year is much more on the social research and to some degree activism side. But where we don't have enough yet, I mean, almost nothing, is as we start to build out the product and R&D capabilities, we haven't really embedded that as well. It's certainly something I'm a champion for, but it's very, embryonic and not a place where I could say, oh, it's this percent of resources. It's not enough.
Thank you.
So I think we're at time, but let's make just one super quick question.
Saying 000 here.
Yeah, I think there's a narrative in the AI field, like kind of outside of this specialized area, that countries and regions that regulate the data and AI, they shoot themselves in the foot. And I think that also causes a lot of capital to not be invested in those regions. Like everyone would bet on a US AI company, but not necessarily on an AI company based in EU. How do we change that narrative outside of this area? Like, do we need a DeepSeek moment happening maybe from Flower? Or like, how do we get out of this narrative?
That Daniel and I are trying to find that DeepSeek or that AlphaGo moment. So if you have ideas how to get there, but I think we do need some of that to shift the imagination. Certainly, our view, but we're more a part of this world than the other one, is there's economic opportunity in balancing. I mean, it kind of goes all the way down to the last question and regulation, balancing human interest and societal interests with, private interest, and that, a healthy system balances those things, and there's money to be made in having healthy systems. And Mozilla Ventures, it's a reason we're invested in companies like Flower. So I think one thing is to shift the narrative and show what's possible. Maybe that is through Flower or people in this room. Another thing is actually to shift where the investing is. So increasingly we find another set of more responsibly focused venture companies as we build out Mozilla Ventures and try to bring them along. So part of it's the public or industry or government narrative. Part of it also is really just shifting the investor mindset, and it's something that I'm interested in seeing how we can do.
From the Flower side, I can only say we're working on it. So,
and we're trying to help.
So Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. Very interesting, and I think there's a lot of threads that we need to continue. Unfortunately, we're out of time now, but I encourage everyone to just bring up your questions. Join us later today at the after hours reception.
I will be there. Okay, thanks, Daniel.